I have questions. Questions that need answering. That was my first impression reading through Red Steel for about the third time. The first read-through, I thought the setting was weird. The second read-through, I knew the setting was weird. The third read-through, and I realized that nothing about the setting made sense. Second edition D&D wasn't kind to Mystara, but in both metaplot as well as quality of product. Editing was a commodity at TSR in the 90s, and it showed. Most of the original Mystara writers were gone, and the ones that were left were tasked more with making content fast than making content playable. Enter the Ispan, or Espan people, depending on their particular location. Arriving on the Red Coast only 100 years ago, there's no mention of Ispa anywhere in any other book. Not in the almanacs, not in the box sets, certainly not in anything dealing with Thyatis. So time to fix this. Welcome to Mystara. I'm Mr. Welch, and we've got mucho trabajo to do. To start with, none of this video is canon outside the recap on the lore. Everything else is me holding down all the maps, sourcebooks, and gazetteers I can find, and beating them until a coherent bit of lore comes out. Ispa was made up explicitly for the Savage Coast, and the people there are based heavily on the Spanish or Portuguese peoples, and the lands they colonized in the Savage Coast. The obvious problem is Thyatis is based on Rome, Byzantium, and Germany. There's no Ispa on the maps of Thyatis, never has been. There's no trace of anything remotely Spanish-related in Thyatis at all, not in any of the names, the cities, or even in the culture. And that's the crux of the matter. What is canon is that 1500 years ago the Red Curse started in the Savage Baronies, and during the Week Without Magic it spread uncontrollably to the other regions. Depending on what books you were reading, and by books I mean between the Player's Guide and the DM's Guide and the Red Steel box set, where the Red Curse ranged before and after the spread is never fully explained, and the sources inside the setting books only make things more confusing. For this video, I'm going with the Red Curse was originally only over part of the baronies, and the curse spread it through most of the baronies, leaving the surrounding areas only slightly affected. That is the least headache-inducing option out of several headache-inducing options. The Ispans showed up about 100 years ago on the Savage Coast, being forcibly settled there by the Thyacians. Despite sharing the Spanish vibe with the Belcadese elves, there's no connection. The elves came from Devania, and while the Ispans were apparently in Thyatis the entire time. I've tried to connect the two cultures together in a single timeline, and it just doesn't. The dates of the arrival and the source of their origins cannot be combined into any coherent story and keep the explanation even remotely plausible. If this sounds like I'm having to explain a lot before moving on to the beef of the subject, it's because this is everything I've had to sort through to figure out just how badly Red Steel was written. That being said, we know when the Ispans arrived. We know they were sent by Emperor Gabrionis IV in the second year of his reign. The lands they were sent to settle were known to be cursed, but the curse was obvious with the red sand and the cursed creatures. They learned to stay out of those areas, and everything was good, at least until the curse spread. But that still doesn't tell us where they came from and why that land is no longer there. It's time to consult the maps and figure out a good place where to locate the original Ispa. 3 regions came to mind looking at the map: Devania, the Isle of Dawn, and the Imperial Territories and future dominions of the original Thyacian map from the Dawn of the Emperors. At first, Devania was the obvious choice, because then I can explain the link between the Ispans and the Belcadese. But Thyatis didn't return to the continent of their origin until after the Ispan relocation to the Savage Coast, and didn't fully begin invading and conquering Devania until decades later. That pretty much eliminated Devania as a source of the Ispans. Then we move on to the Isle of Dawn, with its large amount of emptiness all around. This one becomes tricky, because you're trying to match the Spanish climate with the Thyacian colonies there, and they're based heavily around North England and Scotland. Spain's climate is all over the place, and you're not going to find a lot of moors and highlands around Madrid. The one desert in the Isle of Dawn is in Thothia, which is more like Egypt, rather than the Tabernus Desert in South Spain, which means you are more likely to be bitten by an asp than shot by Lee Van Cleef in Thothia. It's also deep in the Alphatian side of the island. There's not an adjacent Thyacian territory to grab the appropriate land, so Isle of Dawn is a poor match as well. Then we have the Thyacian territories, located directly north of the town of Hillfork, between the regions of Burhor and Halathius. Even better, the northern part of the territories are mountains, whose average height match those of Spain. To the north you will find Yalarum, which is important to setting up one of the Savage Baronies. So we've got the right climate, the right location, and an unnamed and unexplored region deep inside of Thyatis. Madre los Dios, I think we found Ispa. Now that we've got a region to set them in, we have to come up with a reason why they were there and why they left. Why they were there is easy. The Ispan people were the original occupants of what would become Thyatis. They were all happy-and-go-lucky over 1,000 years ago until the 3 tribes appeared over the ocean. The Ispans tried to hold them back, but the Thyacians were just better at waging war. The Ispans were pushed back from the coasts, through the forests, finally into the hill countries, where the terrain favored them, and they were able to finally hold their own. The duchy of Ispa was founded when the Thracians and Ispans made peace, and they were largely left to their own devices after that. Over the years, the Ispans spread out over their territory, but due to the hilly and mountainous terrain, they tended to become quite isolated even from each other. Numerous subcultures emerged based on geography. The Ispans that would later settle Saragon lived adjacent to the Yalari border and adopted many of their customs. The highest settled areas became known for their unique culture and their focus on ranching, and they later became the people of Guadalante. The trading cities that lay on the borders of Ispa were populated by the future Texiarius and Gargona populations. You can put any of the savage, barony people into a region of Ispa with little effort, with just a few exceptions, but those can be explained away in the time since resettlement. Now that we've got Ispa established, we've got to get rid of them. How do you get a large number of people out of a region willingly? I know what you're thinking, but faking a nuclear reactor leak on board a Soviet submarine has been done before. Alright, time for a deep dive. And I know how much you love deep dives, because every time I have to dig up something mentioned once in a product that no one has, can find, or can afford, the crowd goes wild. On the Eastern Nations trail map, there is a list of diseases, and the one specific to the Altan Tepes Mountains, the very mountains that Ispa was founded on or around, is bugbear typhus. This is a nasty illness to catch, with a high infection rate and a serious hit to your constitution. It's fatal inside of a week, but worse, it drives the infected into a state of rage that causes them to attack others in a berserk fit. It's pretty much the virus from 28 Days Later, the rather confusing sequel to Sandra Bullock's dramedy 28 Days. 100 years ago, a rather virulent strain of bugbear typhus absolutely ravaged Ispa. Entire towns were wiped out. The virus kept spreading out of control. The government of Ispa collapsed. The death toll was well over 50% before word even got to the emperor about what was happening. A single legion was dispatched to figure out what was going on, and that ballooned into half a dozen legions when they found themselves attacked by hordes of rage-filled Spaniards. Which is something the guys based on the Italians could understand, just not from the Spaniards. The dead and the slain were stacked like cordwood and burned in place. Ispa was declared a lost cause by the military commander. Emperor Gabronius had a major choice to make. The other regions were not going to let the thousands of Ispan survivors into their area because of the threat of contamination. He couldn't send them back because there was very little left of Ispa. The legion commanders were burning towns and slaughtering all the livestock as a preventative measure. You couldn't get the Ispans to return to their homes regardless. The memories of the plague and the resulting slaughter were recent memories. The emperor consulted his most trusted advisors as the Ispans were quarantined into impromptu camps just inside their borders. After much discussion, one of the imperial cartographers proposed settling the survivors on the savage coast. Not much was known about the specific region. The maps that did exist were woefully outdated and made no mention of the Red Curse or the surrounding nations. As far as they knew it, it was uninhabited. Regardless, any yokels they might find in this new arm of Thyatis would not be able to stand up to the might of the Thyacian legions. The Ispans were taken downriver to a waiting fleet of merchant ships outside of Thyatis City for the journey to their new home. The relocation was not optional. No other domain in Thyatis would take them, and all of Ispa was burning on the orders of the emperor, so there was no going back regardless. The fleet taking them to the Red Coast was old. Nobody wanted to waste good ships on a one-way trip. The refugees had the reputation of being plague carriers, even though the sickness had largely burned itself out. Even the ships sent to escort them maintained a healthy distance. The sailors that crewed the ships were made up of mainly condemned slaves who were given a chance at forgiveness, or naval crew deemed expendable. More than one ship foundered or broke up and sank with all souls, as no one dared stop and rescue what they thought were dead men anyways. The fleet was escorted through Minrathat and Irindi waters by their respective fleets, and finally left unaided once they passed Etrugan. The Ispans landed first at what would become Villa Verde, with the ships moving further along the coast until all the passengers had been unloaded. The Ispan people were then moved further inland until the land was thoroughly settled. Only then did they discover the curse and all the horrible things that came with it. The Ispans just can't catch a break. As far as old Ispa goes, nothing remains. While the epidemic burned itself out in a matter of months, Thyatis was not taking that chance. Every town was leveled. Only the most stubborn and, more importantly, the most remote settlements remained. The legions were quite meticulous in wiping out all aspects of Ispa. Anyone who even looked like they were infected were immediately killed. All that remained of the province once the legions had left were burned out buildings, torn down walls, and smoking corpses. Gabronius IV did know how to get things done in his early years. As the decades went by and the regions showed no signs of infection that had devastated the population, it was slowly reopened up for resettlement. It is still considered a cursed region, believed to be filled with not just disease, but undead and angry spirits from all the death and destruction. Emperor Thenkal reorganized the territory shortly after gaining power, and it's his hope to reestablish some sort of government in the region and get money flowing back into the coffers. Getting people to move there is the trick. He's periodically sent in patrols to show that the region is safe, regardless of the reputation. Finding new rulers is easy, as he can reward any one of his enemies by giving them a title and relocating them to the now imperial territory of Altenia. That's one version of where to establish Ispa. It's not canon, and its creation is of my own making. But this does kill one of the largest continuity problems with the Red Steel, and where the hell did all these people come from? It's plausible, it doesn't step on any established canon, and it gives you a lot of plot hooks in the process. Next week I'm looking at something much easier and far more known. The town of Threshold, the starting town in Keramikos, the home of Alina. Well, in past tense anyways. But until then, yo soy español, español, español.